by Ephraim Wolfhook on bass. Bob Kincaid was in and out of the kitchen, garnishing and inspecting every dish. Everything seemed just right. "This is a really terrific place. I've been wanting to come here for years," Christine said, as she looked around approvingly at the cherrywood bar, the sweeping staircase up to the main restaurant. I had never seen her like this, all dressed up, and she was even more beautiful than I had thought. She had on a long black slip dress that showed off nicely toned shoulders. A cream-colored shawl fringed in black lace was draped over one arm. She had on black flat-heeled pumps, but she was still nearly 6 feet tall, and she smelled of flowers. We were escorted to a cozy little booth at a mezzanine section. I usually try to keep physical allure in its place, but heads turned as Christine and I walked across the dining room. I'd completely forgotten what it was like to be out with someone and have that happen. I must admit that I sort of liked the feeling. I was remembering what it was like to be with someone you want to be with. I was also remembering what it was like to feel whole, or almost whole, or at least on the way to being whole again. "So how was your day?" Christine asked, after we settled into the booth. "Uneventful," I said and shrugged. "Just another day in the life of the DCPD." Christine shrugged right back at me. "I heard something on the radio about a shooting at Union Station. Weren't you involved just a little bit with Gary Sinigi at one point in your illustrious career?" Sorry, I'm off duty now," I said to her. "I love your dress, by the way." $31, she said, and smiled shyly. "Wonderfully." The dress looked like a million on her. I checked her eyes to see if she was all right. It was more than 6 months since her husband's death, but that really isn't a lot of time. We picked out a nice bottle of Merlot. Then we shared Ipswich clams, which were full belly and a little messy, but a good start to dinner at Kincaid's. For a main dish, I had a velvety salmon stew. All the while we ate, the two of us never shut up, not for a minute. I hadn't felt so free and easy around someone in a long, long time. The time flew by like nothing at all. I would have guessed it was maybe 9:30 when I happened to glance at my watch. It was actually 10 to 12. "It's a school night," Christine said. "I have to go, Alex. I really do. My coach will turn into a pumpkin and all that." Her car was parked on 19th Street, and we walked there together. The streets were silent, empty, glittering under overhead lamps. I felt as if I had a little too much to drink, but I knew I hadn't. I was feeling carefree, remembering what it was like to be that way. "I'd like to do this again sometime. How about tomorrow night?" I said and started to smile. God, I liked the way this was going. Suddenly, something was wrong. I saw a look I didn't like, sadness and concern. Christine peered into my eyes. "I don't think so, Alex. I'm sorry," she said. "I'm really sorry. I thought I was ready, but I guess maybe I'm not." I sucked in a breath. I wasn't expecting that. "Thanks for taking me to just about the nicest restaurant I've ever been to. I'm really, really sorry. It's nothing that you did, Alex." Christine continued to look into my eyes. She seemed to be searching for something, and I guess not finding it. She got into her car without saying another word. She seemed so efficient suddenly, so in control. She started the car and drove away. I stood in the empty street and watched until her car's blazing brake lights disappeared.
Gary Sinigi strolled the well-lit streets of Wilmington seemingly without a care in the world. Why should he worry? He was skillful enough at makeup and disguises to fool the stiffs living here in Wilmington. He'd fooled them in Washington, hadn't he? He carried a duffel bag, but didn't draw any attention to himself. The people he saw on his little walk looked as if they'd outfitted themselves from the pages of the Sears catalog circa 1961. Lots of twill that didn't exactly flatter girth, putrid-colored plaid, comfortable brown shoes on everybody. He heard the grating mid-Atlantic accent a few times, too. "I've got to phone home." A plain and ugly dialect for plain and ugly thoughts. Jesus, what a place to have lived! How the hell had he survived during those sterile years? Why had he bothered to come back now? Well, he knew the answer to that question. Seniji knew why he'd come back. Revenge. Payback time. He turned onto his old street, Central Avenue. He stopped across from a white-painted brick house. He stared at the house for a long time. It was a modest colonial 2 stories. It had belonged to Missy's grandparents originally, which was why she hadn't moved. Click your heels together, Gary. Jesus, there's no place like home. He opened his duffel bag and took out his weapon of choice. He was especially proud of this one. He'd been waiting for a long time to use it. Gary Seniji finally crossed the street. He marched up to the front door as if he owned the place. He used the key that he had from 4 years ago, the last time he'd been there, the day Alex Cross had barged into his life along with his partner, John Sampson. He opened the door, and how sweet. His wife and daughter were waiting up for him, eating poppycock and watching Friends on television. "Hi, remember me?" Seniji said in a soft voice. They both started to scream. His own sweet wife, Missy, his darling little girl, Ronnie, screaming like strangers because they knew him so well and because they had seen his weapon.
The war room inside police headquarters was filled beyond capacity with ringing telephones, percolating computers, state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. I wasn't fooled by all the activity or the noise. We were still nowhere on the shootings. First thing, I was asked to give a briefing on Seniji. I was supposed to know him better than anyone else. We had what's called a round table. Over the course of an hour, I shorthanded the details of his kidnapping of 2 children a few years earlier in Georgetown, his eventual capture, the dozens of interviews we'd had at Lorton Prison prior to his escape. Once everybody on the task force was up to speed, I got back to work myself. I worked through lunch and never noticed the time. It took that long to retrieve the mountain of data we had collected on Seniji. Around 2 in the afternoon, I found myself painfully aware of pushpins on the big board, where we were collecting important information. A war room just isn't a war room without pushpin maps and a large bulletin board. At the very top of our board was the name that had been given to the case by the chief of detectives. He had chosen Webb, since Seniji had already picked up the nickname Spider in police circles. Actually, I coined the nickname. It came out of the complex webs he was always able to spin. One section of the big board was devoted to civilian leads. These were mostly reliable eyewitness accounts from the previous morning at Union Station. Another section was police leads, most of which were the detectives' reports from the train terminal. Civilian leads are untrained eye reports. Police leads are trained eye. The thread in all the reports so far was that no one had a good description of what Gary Seniji looked like now. Since Seniji had demonstrated unusual skill with disguises in the past, the news wasn't surprising. Seniji's personal history was displayed on another part of the board. A long, curling computer printout listed every jurisdiction where he had ever been charged with a crime, including several unsolved homicides from his early years in Princeton, New Jersey. Polaroid pictures depicting the evidence we had so far were also pinned up. Captions had been written in marker on the photos. The captions read, "Known skills, Gary Seniji. Hiding locations, Gary Seniji. Physical characteristics, Gary Seniji. Preferred weapons, Gary Seniji." There was a category for known associates on the board, but this was still bare. It was likely to remain that way. To my knowledge, Seniji had always worked alone. Was that assumption still accurate, I wondered? Had he changed since our last run-in? Around 6:30 that night, I got a call from the FBI evidence labs in Quantico. Curtis Waddle was a friend of mine. "You sitting down, Alex? Or you pacing around with one of them insipid state-of-the-art cordless phones in your hand?" he asked. "I'm pacing, Curtis, but I'm carrying around an old-fashioned phone." The lab head laughed, and I could picture his broad, freckled face, his frizzy red hair tied with rubber bands in a ponytail. Good man, good man. Listen, Alex, I've got something here, but I don't think you're going to like it. I don't like it. The blood we found on the stock and barrel of the rifle at Union Station? We've got a definite match on it. It's not Siniji's blood. I didn't like hearing that at all. What the hell does that mean? Whose blood is it then, Curtis? You know yet? I could hear him sigh, then blow out air in a whoosh. Alex, it's yours. Your blood was on the sniper rifle.
It was rush hour in Penn Station in New York City when Suniji arrived. He was on time, right on schedule for the next act. He had planned to get to New York between 5 and 5:30, and here he was. "You may now board through Gate A to Track 8, Bayhead Junction," a fatherly voice proclaimed to the clueless. The train station was filled to the gills with shoving, pushing, and grumbling New Yorkers at their worst. These goddamn commuters were unbelievably aggressive and irritating. None of them came close to approaching his own seething anger, though, not even close. His hatred was pure, distilled. He was anger. He did the things most of them only fantasized about. Their anger was fuzzy and unfocused, bursting in their bubbleheads. He saw anger clearly, and he acted upon it swiftly. Gary Sinigi had a 6-inch knife pressed against his leg. It was a real collector's item, had a mother-of-pearl handle and a tight serpentine blade on both sides. An ornate knife for an ornate individual, a greasy salesman had told him once upon a long time ago. "Wrap it up," he'd said. Had it ever since, for special occasions like today. Or once to kill an FBI agent named Roger Graham. He passed Hudson News with all of its glossy magazine faces staring out at the world, staring at him, trying to work their propaganda. He was still being shoved and elbowed by his fellow commuters. Man, didn't they ever stop? Wow! He saw a character from his dreams, from way back when he was a kid. There was the guy, no doubt about it. He recognized the face, the way the guy held his body, everything about him. It was the guy in the gray-striped business getup, the one who reminded him of his father. "You've been asking for this for a long time," Sunichi growled at Mr. Gray Stripes. "You asked for this." He drove the knife blade forward, felt it sink into flesh. It was just as he had imagined it. The businessman saw the knife plunge near his heart. A frightened, bewildered look crossed his face. Then he fell to the station floor, stone cold dead, his eyes rolled back and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Suniji knew what he had to do next. He pivoted, danced to his left, and cut a second victim who looked like a slacker type. The guy wore a naked lacrosse T-shirt. The details didn't matter, but some of them stuck in his mind. He cut a black man selling street news, 3 for 3. The thing that really mattered was the blood. Suniji watched as the precious blood spilled onto the dirty, stained, and mottled concrete floor. It spattered the clothes of commuters, pooled under the bodies. The blood was a clue, a Rorschach test for the police and the FBI hunters to analyze. The blood was there for Alex Cross to try and figure out. Gary Sinigi dropped his knife. There was incredible confusion, shrieking everywhere, panic in Penn Station that finally woke the walking dead. He looked up at the maze of maroon signs, each with neat Helvetic lettering, exit 31st Street, parcel checking, visitor information, 8th Avenue subway. He knew the way out of Penn Station. It was all preordained. He had made this decision 1,000 times before. He scurried back down into the tunnels again. No one tried to stop him. He was the bad boy again. Maybe his stepmother had been right about that. His punishment would be to ride the New York subways.
7 p.m. that evening. I was caught in the strangest, most powerful epiphany. I felt that I was outside myself, watching myself. I was driving by the Sojourner Truth School, on my way home. I saw Christine Johnson's car and stopped. I got out of my car and waited for her. I felt incredibly vulnerable, a little foolish. I hadn't expected Christine to be at the school this late. At 7:15, she finally wandered out of the school. I couldn't catch my breath from the instant I spotted her. I felt like a schoolboy. Maybe that was all right. Maybe it was good. At least I was feeling again. Christine saw me, and she immediately looked troubled. She kept on walking, as if she were in a hurry to be somewhere else, anywhere else but here. Her arms were crossed across her chest. A bad sign, I thought. The worst possible body language. Protective and fearful. One thing was clear already. Christine Johnson didn't want to see me. I knew I shouldn't have come, shouldn't have stopped.